Hello everybody, Darren here with Renaissance Coders. Thanks for joining us for another editor scripting tutorial, where in this series we're designing an enemy designer tool that's going to allow us to easily define specifications for different types of enemies for our game, and then it's going to let us create prefabs and data assets pretty easily. So in this tutorial we're going to start defining the textures and layouts for the regions of our window. Right now it's just an empty window, but we're going to be fixing that in this tutorial. So we're going to be dealing with texture 2Ds, colors, the Rect class, and then we're going to be learning two different ways to define textures. We're going to learn about the functions GUI.DrawTexture and GUI.BeginArea, and then we're going to learn about the event functions OnEnable and OnGUI. So here, first of all, we have OnEnable, and that's going to be similar to the start or awake function if we're used to just regular scripting in Unity. Okay, and then we have our initialize texture 2D function, which is going to initialize all of our texture 2Ds. That's about all it's going to do. And then here we have OnGUI, and OnGUI is similar to different update functions, in regular scripting. So update, fixed update, or late update. But it's not called once per frame, it's called one or more times per interaction. So anytime our mouse goes over the window or clicks on a button or makes any sort of interaction, OnGUI will get called one or more times. Okay, and here we have GUILayout function, which will be called inside OnGUI. And this function is going to define the Rect values that we defined up top, and it's going to paint the textures based on those Rects. Okay, and here we have four functions for drawing different regions. So we have draw header, draw mage settings, draw warrior settings, and draw rogue settings. And these functions are going to control the contents of each region. So if we have different input fields for mage or warrior or header, then we know that drawing them with inside these functions is going to restrict those fields to those Rect regions. Okay, so let's go through and start adding content to each of these functions as we need to. For OnEnable, all we need to do for now is call init textures. So this is going to, again, define all of our texture 2D values. And in init textures, we want to go ahead and define our texture 2Ds that we declared up here. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll start off with the header section texture. And what I'm doing now is going to be the first way of defining a texture 2D for editor scripting. So we'll define it by saying it's a new texture 2D that's 1 pixel wide and 1 pixel high. And then what we do is we set the color of that pixel. And the reason it's going to be a 1 by 1 pixel is because we only want one color for now. So I'm going to set the pixel at the 0th position, and I'm going to set the color to header section color, which is a variable that I defined up here. And this is a color value that I thought was good for the purpose of this tutorial. So after those two lines, all we need to do is say header section texture.apply. Okay, now there's another way of defining textures, which I'll use a little bit later in this tutorial. But for now, we want to make sure that this method of doing things actually works for us. So after we initialize that texture, we can come down to OnGUI. And what we want to do here is call our other four functions, or 5 functions actually. Now in draw layouts is where we're actually going to be discussing the meaty section, so to speak, of this tutorial. And so we have defined our header section texture. So for now, all we want to do is define our header section Rect. So our Rect has 4 properties: X, Y, width, and height. So the X and Y will be the position. And our header section is going to be sort of like a banner that goes at the top of our window. So we want that to be about 50 pixels high. And we want it to always maintain the width of whatever our window is, regardless of whether the user resizes the window or not. So the X and Y position will be 0. And this just means it's going to be in the top left corner of the window at all times. And then we want to set the width. Remember I said that the width needs to be the width of the window at all times. And when we're finding the width of the window, we can actually access the screen property. So we can just say screen.width, and that's going to give us the width of the window. Finally, we want to define the height, and this can be whatever value you want. I want the header text to be a little bit large, so I'm going to make the header section height 50. Okay, and then after we define the header section height, one more step, and that is calling GUI.DrawTexture. And in that, we're going to pass the rect and the texture. So the rect is header section, and the texture is header section texture. And as you can see, we have the banner up top, which is our header. And inside that header later, we're going to put the actual enemy designer title up there. But let's go ahead and define the mage, warrior, and rogue regions. Now what I did for this is I wanted to add my own textures, and this is the second way of defining textures for editor windows. Now I have textures right here which are 512s by 512s, and they're gradient, so that's the reason I wanted to use textures for these. And if you end up doing this, then you'll want to select your textures, and I found that the best results come from making the texture type sprite, generate bitmaps will be on, and then just change your max size to whatever the max size should be. Now it's not going to matter too much for these textures, but whenever we get into detailed icons a little bit later in this series, it's really going to matter. And again, I found that sprite texture type works the best. So with that being said, we're going to start talking about the second way to define textures for editor windows. And this way is a little bit easier in my opinion, as long as you have a good texture for your window. Now I'm going to be defining the mage section, warrior section, and rogue section at this point. So we're going to define our textures in this way, where we're calling resources.load. So another important point to mention is that your texture needs to be inside of the resources folder. As you can see, my texture is inside my resources, and then it's inside of icons. So we have resources and then icons, and then we have the name of the texture. And so that's actually how I'm passing the string value. We don't need to explicitly define resources. In this case, we can just say icons, because resources.load assumes that we're inside the resources folder. In fact, resources.load doesn't really assume anything. It just begins its path at the resource directory. So I'm passing icons and then the name of my texture, just like that. And then as far as painting the texture, it's going to be the same. Inside the draw layouts function, we want to call GUI.DrawTexture, mage section, and then mage section texture. Now, even though we do that, we still need to define what mage section actually is. And so I'm going to copy and paste the header section code because it's roughly similar. Okay, and what we're going to be doing here is setting the X and Y. The Y is going to be different because we don't want the position, the Y position of the mage section to be the same as the header section. We actually want that to be starting where the header section ends, which is at 50 pixels. So we'll start the Y off at 50 pixels. Now, since we're going to have 3 partitions for the mage, warrior, and rogue sections, we want to make sure that the width of the mage section is screen.width divided by 3f. So it'll only be 1/3 the width of whatever the screen width is going to be. And then the height needs to be all the way down to the bottom of the window. So we'll say that the height is screen.width, but we're going to subtract 50 pixels because the header section takes up the first 50 pixels. Okay, and then after I do that, we should be able to go back to Unity and see that section showing up. Okay, and as you can see, the mage section is showing up as we wanted it to. If I extend the width of this window, you can see that the mage section will always maintain the 1/3 width of the entire window, which is exactly what we wanted. Now let's define the warrior and the rogue sections. And this is going to be very similar. So let's go back to step 1, which is defining the texture. So we want to, I'll go ahead and copy and paste this so it's a little bit quicker. So we want to define the warrior and the rogue section. So we have warrior and rogue section texture. And the difference is going to be the name of that texture. So instead of editor mage gradient, which is the name of my mage texture, it's going to be editor warrior and editor rogue gradient. Again, this value is going to be different based on the name of your texture. So just keep that in mind. Now, after we define our textures, we'll go ahead and copy this block of code. And this is going to be very similar. The only real difference right here is going to be the X position of these sections. So let's start off with our warrior section. The X is going to start off where the width of our last section left off. So screen.width divided by 3 should be the X position for our warrior. Now with that being said, the width of our warrior section is the same, but it's starting at screen width divided by 3, which means the width is going to reach screen width divided by 3 times 2 in terms of the total width of the window, which means for our rogue section, the X position is going to start off at screen width divided by 3 times 2. So just to explicitly get that point across, I'm going to write it out in this way. All right, and now that we've done that, we should be able to go back. Well, first we need to define our GUI.DrawTexture, or else we're not going to see anything. So that's kind of easy to forget. All right, and now we can go back to Unity and hopefully see all of our regions laid out properly. All right, looks like we're getting an error, null texture passed to draw textures. Let's see what that's about. So it's our rogue section that's the problem. Now sometimes this happens. Here we go. So the problem is I just passed in the wrong value for my resources.load call. This needs to be rogue. I don't know why I typed gradient there, but that should fix the issue. All right, and now we have our first method of drawing a texture, which is the header section. And as you can see, there's no gradient there because it's a single color. But I did want the gradient on the 3 partitions here, just because I think it looks a little bit nicer. All right, now before we close up this tutorial, I did want to talk about GUILayout.BeginArea, which accepts a Rect parameter. So we're going to use header section. Now every begin call in editor scripting should be complemented by an end call. So for GUILayout.BeginArea, we want GUILayout.EndArea. And this is an important concept with editor scripting. And it's one of the reasons why editor scripting can be so verbose and it seems so explicit. Now you can think of begin area as an opening curly brace and end area as a closing curly brace, and everything within those curly braces is going to be restrained to the header section rect. Well, everybody, that's going to end it for this tutorial. In the next video, we're going to learn how to add text to our window. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.